Hi folks, today we're going to be jumping back onto the timber frame. I want to make sure that all of the beams are finished before we get too much further on the fit out of the workshop. That's going to involve shaping the corners a little bit with the router, sanding and getting ready to oil. So stick around and we'll make a start. Right, so we're now at a point where all of the corners have been routed off pretty much everywhere. There's a little bit of chisel work to do, just where I need to get past pegs and things like that. I do want to do some sanding, cleaning of the timbers, and then we'll oil them. And I'll continue with that in this video. But for now, I'm going to put a pause on it and I'm going to jump onto the flooring. I want to get self-leveling down and get ready to epoxy. The weather is warmer. Drying times are going to be better, so I'm going to make the most of that. Anyway, so we'll skip ahead. Hopefully by then, we'll have a nicer floor and we'll get sanding these beams. All the beams sanded to a decent point. You could keep going and going, but at the end of the day it's a timber frame, not a tabletop. So they're nice and smooth now, much more even colours. There's a little bit of greying up there and a few saw marks shown, but what I'm going to do is now get some oil on there. I'm going to make up a bit of a home brew. So the main reason I want to get some finish or some oil on the beams is to stop them drying too quickly. Now we're all closed in. Although they're not exposed to sun, they will start drying pretty rapidly, and then you start getting the checking and the cracks, and although that doesn't really affect it structurally, aesthetically it's going to be a bit nicer if it just dries a little bit slower. So what I'm going to do is just mix up linseed oil, raw linseed oil, and some turpentine, like natural stuff. I've read 50-50, some people add in some other bits, but I think that should be enough. This will just thin it down, hopefully it'll penetrate in a bit further, but the linseed oil is the key. And being that it's raw, I'm guessing that as well as being nicer, it hasn't got all the chemicals in, it's going to dry slower which means maybe the timber will dry slower as well. Anyway, it's all an experiment. That's probably more like 2/3 than 1/3. That's just one coat of that linseed and turpentine. It's already touch dry, so I don't know if that's because I've thinned it out, it's soaked in quicker, or maybe it's not quite dry, but it's certainly soaking in nicely and it's good penetration on it. It does definitely bring out some of the imperfections, so let me show you what I've done and what I haven't done. So I gave things a fairly good sand. Over in this corner, which is a less visible corner of the workshop, there's a bit of water staining here which had gone a bit grey. And a couple of sawmill marks. I'm fine with that, but when you put the oil on, it does make them stand out a little bit more. I'm not too worried over here, but over the other side, you can see how much it darkens, and it will lighten down a bit, but that is where I've stopped the finish. Over here, there's quite a few sawmill marks, and just a little bits I want to sand off before we finish it. This will be kind of the background of a lot of videos in the future, so this is worth getting right. You can see just up here it needs a little bit of a sanding, there's some sawmill blade marks there. If you just oil straight over, it's fine, but they just show up a little bit more. Beams are pretty much there now. I mean, you could recoat them every year or something, just give them a wipe over with a bit of the linseed oil, but at least they're now fairly sealed in a way that linseed oil, I think, is still quite breathable. So moisture is going to be able to get out of the timber, but probably at a slower rate. So hopefully that will just reduce any of the cracking and let things be a bit more controlled as they shrink. Of course, I didn't get the back of the beams and the posts, or not most of them, so ideally you could do this before you raise the frame. Now I realised that I kind of skimmed over when I was talking about the router and taking that chamfer off on the beams, and I figured that actually some of you might not even know what a router is or may not have used one, so I thought I'd kind of run through the basics. This is a small 1/4 inch collet router. The larger plunge router I've got is the 1/2 inch collet, so that's essentially what size bits, or the shaft of the bit that it takes. But the principle behind a router, although I'm not an expert, from one DIY to another, it's basically a very fast spinning drill in some respects, and it's very controlled in one axis, so it's kind of nice and straight. And by having that base on it, it's quite controlled. So you're able to either kind of cut grooves into something, or in the case of these beams, we're taking the edge off something. This is the bit I was using. It's a simple chamfer bit, and it cuts a 45-degree angle on the corners. And you see this bearing here, what that does is it controls it. So if we compare that to a plane, you could use a hand plane. You would have to either mark your lines on there or do it by eye to get it nice and even. So when you've got the base on there, that's gonna keep you nice and square. Imagine this shaft is running square to whatever surface you're running along. And underneath, this bearing can never go further that way than the surface of the wood. So if you run your router along, your bearing's gonna roll against there, and the depth of cut or the angle of cut is always gonna remain the same. It's gonna take the same amount of material off wherever you go, unless you back the router away from the workpiece, and in which case it will be a shallower cut. So you want to make sure you're up against it, and if you did miss anyway, you can kind of come back in and just put a little bit more pressure on. If you're using a router on softwood, sometimes I find that bearing actually leaves a small indentation in there, so you do want to be careful. You don't want to be pushing really hard against it. It's normally light enough that you can sand it out anyway, but that's just something to bear in mind. Also, you need to think about the direction of cut when you're using a router, especially if it's a bearing like this. You're normally always working from left to right, and if it's upside down in a router table, then you're working from right to left and working it across a bit, but you'll soon feel it, because if you go one way, it's going to take it away from you, whereas you'll want to be cutting into the wood rather than spinning away from the wood. It's not always left to right, because if you're working around the outside of a piece of wood, you're working anti-clockwise all the way around it, so there is a point where you could be going right to left. But normally, if you're facing the piece of wood with a bearing type bit like this, you're going up against the timber and along. While we're talking router basics, I will have to say that this 1/4 inch router will do 90% of what I need. The 1/2 inch one, the big plunge router I've got, I simply don't use. Unless I'm flattening a piece of timber, or maybe doing a kitchen worktop or something, I simply don't need it, and it lives upside down now in a little router table that I've made. This will do everything from corners to grooves, if you're making up some tongue and groove type board. It's great if you put a little V-bit in here, you can do kind of carving. And the other thing I use it for, if you put a normal fluted bit, which is just a straight bit, for cutting the hinge mortises, if you're hanging a door, you can set it to the depth or thickness of the hinge material, and you can just route it all out. And although it's a little bit dustier than a hammer and chisel, it's a really neat job and very controlled way of doing little mortises like that. Anyway, that's enough of the router basics. I will leave a link to this one, but you will find them in every brand, flavour, colour and size you can dream of. I'll leave you with a few close-ups of all the posts and beams now that they're done. We're really picking up speed now on the workshop, so a huge thank you to everyone who's been watching the videos, commenting on the videos, joining us on Instagram, and of course joining us on Patreon. I'll leave links to all of that down in the description, and of course if you do want to support the channel, the best way you can do it is to buy a mug or a t-shirt. But that's it, thank you for watching. Remember, if you can, do it yourself, and we'll see you next time.